All right, good morning. How are you guys doing?
Good.
All right. So, any questions over the readings? All right. So, everybody go ahead and get ready. As soon as we're ready in the back, I will. All right, so what is détente? Okay, easing of tension between the US and the Soviet Union, and also a little bit between the US and China, right? Why is this important?
So we don't blow each other up.
Okay, because everybody has nuclear weapons and everybody's a little on edge. How does it come about? China and Russia actually had a fight with each other And so that made China more willing to start working with the US. And once China started working with the US, the Soviet Union was like, wait, I don't want China and the US against me. So they start talking to the US. So, all right. If you had the basics of détente, that's what I was looking for. So, what are we talking about today? Whose administration? Okay, Nixon. What do you know about Nixon? Watergate. That is almost 100%. Everybody knows Watergate and very little else, right? So hopefully we will talk a little bit more and give you a little better understanding of Nixon. So when Nixon is up for the election in 1968, Johnson has already frustrated people, right? The Democratic Party has kind of imploded. There's a lot of people who are fighting with the police and fighting for civil rights of various groups, right? You have all the revolutions. And so Nixon comes into this and says, you know what? I'm for law and order. So he appeals to just the average middle class white person in America. And realistically to others as well. He appeals to the people that are like, I just want things to be settled down. And so there is a discussion that he had a Southern strategy. The Southern strategy nickname actually came from the press. So what happened is Johnson had passed the Civil Rights Act, had pushed the Civil Rights Act, and had pushed the Southern whites away from the Democratic Party while it was picking up African Americans. And so, again, you are seeing a lot of pushes towards civil rights. Nixon says, you know what? I am going to push for law and order versus anarchy. Strict constructionist understanding with the Supreme Court. What is a strict constructionist versus a loose constructionist or a other perspective? Strict constructionist is going to say, hey, if it is not dealt with in the Constitution, then it should go to the states. So Dobbs would be a strict constructionist ruling from the Supreme Court. It says the Supreme Court does not have authority to make laws. It does not have authority to create new guidance. It has authority to implement and to ensure that is what is written is there. So strict constructionist is going to say the Constitution is a document that we need to walk through and follow. A more loose constructionist is going to say, well, the Constitution can be changed and, you know, we can determine what it should have said. So he is going to be more law and order, strict constructionist. He does oppose court-ordered busing, but he says we are going to continue to desegregate schools. He does promise that he will put a Southerner on the Supreme Court. So in that way does push for the South. The interesting piece, though, is the South is changing during this time. There is a huge growth in the South, and a lot of it comes from the Rust Belt, which is, you know, Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, all the places where you had the factories. The factories have been unionized, and so a lot of the companies decide to move south. There are other reasons, but I would like to think that air conditioning has a big part in that. Because once you have air conditioning, then living in Texas is not nearly as bad as it would be otherwise, right? So the South has changed a lot. There's incredible economic growth. There's a change in the South. There's a 40% population growth. So you have all these changes, and what you start seeing are changes in the political environment. Now, I put all these up here because some people are like, oh yeah, there was this huge change and the South went immediately for the Republicans and Nixon. But what you're going to start seeing is actually in 68, the Southerners don't vote for the Republicans. In 72, almost everybody in the nation does. 76, you have the Democrats controlling the South. 80, again, the Republicans control almost the entire U.S. in 84. So you really don't have the Republican South until 2000. But Nixon is trying to make sure he's elected. And interestingly enough, once he's elected, he is faced with a very, very big difficulty. So you have stagflation. What is stagflation? We're actually talking about it now again, right?
It's when like the U.S. debt increased because of the Vietnam War and the Great Society, and it like quadrupled the inflation rate.
Okay, so you have a load of debt. People borrow money, borrow money, borrow money, and now you have to pay back those debts. Well, when you borrow a certain amount of money and you're not paying back those debts, that means that you have to pay lots of interest, right? And so sort of like what you're seeing now after COVID and all the other opportunities that people have had to spend money, the US dollar is starting to be worth less. So inflation goes up. All the prices that you're paying for everything, you pay prices for gas, for food, everything else goes up. At the same time, you have a lot of baby boomers and women joining the workforce, right? So while that's a positive thing, what does it do to wages? It makes your wages go down. So the cost of living is going up while the wages are going down. What does that do to the average person? It's kind of a double whammy, right? Your money is less, at the same time everything else costs more, so it makes your living a lot harder. And so in addition to the other things we've discussed, the Vietnam War and Great Society and all the spending on those and the people entering the workforce, all of a sudden you start to see a lot of poorer countries start to enter the competition for manufacturing. And so now they can produce things cheaper because they are cheaper than US workers. And so a lot of industrialization starts to move to other countries. This further causes problems with US factories and jobs and reduces the number of jobs. In addition, OPEC, everybody knows who OPEC is, right? They're the oil producing countries, and they decide that they are frustrated. Most of the OPEC companies are Arab. They don't like the fact that the US has supported Israel, and so they decide to raise the price of oil and gas by 400%. Now, you guys have seen the price of gas go up, right? Pretty considerably. So what do you think the price of gas was, I don't know, like a year and a half ago, 2 years ago? If I remember right, it's like $2.70, something like that, or actually probably $1.70, right? $2, all right. So 400% increase would go $2 to $8 a gallon. Now the other thing is it's really hard to get gas. So you start to see, and this happens more under Jimmy Carter, but you start to see people struggling to get gas. And so everything gets more difficult. You've got to figure out, how do I keep my job? Once I keep my job, what can I afford? What can I hold on to? And, so instead of having the loads of money from the 50s, now people are struggling a little bit. All right. Domestically, what does Nixon do? Nixon is kind of a pragmatist. So Bill Clinton becomes a pragmatist in his second term, but he says, all right, I have a lot of Republicans who voted for me. I actually have a lot of Democrats who voted for me, I have a lot of independents who vote for me. So I need to kind of make all of them happy if I can. Now, why does he have Democrats voting for him? A lot of the Democrats who are really frustrated by all of the revolutions, the social revolutions that we talked about, vote for Nixon because they say, we just want stability. So he has got to come up with a center path that isn't going to tick off too many voters. So he pushes the Voting Rights Act amendments. Prior to this, there were laws put in place that said if you were one of the states that prevented African Americans from voting, any change that you make to voting requirements has to be approved through the federal government before you can start doing it. Now, the intent is we want to stop the laws like the grandfather law that said if your grandfather voted, you could vote. The testing to see if you could read, which was misused. The poll tax. So they're saying, all right, we're not going to allow you to put in new things until the federal government ensures that this is not just a means of preventing African Americans from voting. Nixon rolls in and he continues this requirement for another 5 years. He stops literacy tests and reduces the residency requirements. He then says he's going to change the voting age from 21 to 18. Why is this important? What is he trying to accomplish?
Wants younger people to vote for him.
Wants younger people to vote. Now it's interesting because most younger people are not going to vote for him. Why would he want to pass something that changes from 21 to 18? What happens when you're 18?
You can get drafted.
You can get drafted. And a lot of the protesters are saying it's not fair. We can go to war and die for our country, but we can't vote to put our leadership in. And Nixon says, you know what? You're absolutely right. So he moves the voting age from 21 to 18. So if you're eligible for the draft, you're also eligible to vote. This is one of the few times where you actually see a president in power who is willing to harm his future election campaigns by bringing in people who probably won't vote for him. But intriguingly, they pass this, and the first thing that happens is the Supreme Court declares this to be illegal. They say that you cannot change the voting age because it has an impact on the states. So, if you want to violate a Supreme Court directive, what do you have to do? What is the Supreme Court supposed to base all their decisions on?
The Constitution.
The Constitution. So if you want to change a Supreme Court decision, what do you need to do? You change the Constitution. So we actually change the Constitution and place the 26th Amendment in. And what does the 26th Amendment do? Okay, you guys can help me with this. It changes the voting age from 21 to 18. Now, Nixon also sees that a lot of people are really struggling because of stagflation. So how can he help the American people? And he decides he's going to give $30 billion to the states, and he calls it New Federalism, and he says, what I want you to do is come up with programs that are going to give money to the poor. This means, now, there are lots of people out there who are not able to get jobs, right? So if I just say, hey, create jobs, then the federal government's going to be on the hook for holding these jobs forever. So he says, all right, what I want you to do is guarantee an income for poor people who are looking for jobs, who are actively searching for a job and just can't get one right now. Either that or people who are training to get a job. Now the Senate defeats this, but they are trying to push this to say, how do we get people employed? How do we get people to have the money to deal with stagflation? The other thing he does is tie the Social Security benefits to the cost of living. What does that do? Who gets Social Security for the most part?
Does not everybody?
No. So older people or people with disabilities, right? So if you're older and all of a sudden the price of inflation moves gas from $2 to $8, what does that do to your ability to live? If your salary stays the same, then you're in a world of hurt, right? So this means, hey, if you're on Social Security, if you are not able to work, we are going to increase your income to the point where it matches the cost of living so that you can survive. All right? Some of the other things he does, he creates the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. What does that do for you? All right, so since this is on TV, what happens if I decide that my projector is not working and I just grab one of the tables and I start climbing on the table?
Well, it covers you if you end up falling.
All right, the Occupational Safety and Health Act is going to say, no, 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 you cannot just grab a table. You need to get someone and have a ladder that is safe, and you get on the ladder. So everybody has seen a ladder, right? What, is there a little sign on the top step? Do you remember? Yeah, what does it say?
Do not step on this step.
Yeah, it says do not step, not a step. And I'm always like, it is a step. I could step if I want to. But why are you not supposed to?
Because you're at the top and it's easier for you to fall out.
All right, because once you get to the top, it's easier to fall off. That is an OSHA requirement, right? There are a lot of other OSHA requirements that say, hey, you need to be careful. You need to, your boss cannot make you do things that are unsafe. When we were in Mississippi, we actually were painting the house and we had a staircase. There were some guys that came in, and all of a sudden I realized they had put a ladder on 2 paint cans, and it was super unsafe looking, and I was like, all right, stop, no, you can't do this, because if you guys fall and you kill yourself, then it's on me because I allowed you to do this in my house, right? So same thing, OSHA says, hey, you got to be safe. What about the Environmental Protection Agency? What does that do for you? It tries to monitor the factories and different things to say, hey, are you producing a whole lot of pollution? And if you do, then you need to stop. The Federal Election Campaign Act basically says, hey, elections need to be if the people like you, not if corporations like you. So in the past, they have been able to, corporations could throw lots of money into election campaigns, and they said that's not right. Now, intriguingly, that has changed back, right? Now, corporations are deemed people, and they can donate into the election campaigns. Again, like I said, he pushed against busing, but he does enforce the desegregation of schools. He has set aside jobs for minorities for federally funded construction projects. Now, why would he do this? What's his impact? Again, he's trying to ensure that minorities have opportunities to work, right? This is stagflation. This is a time where things are going to be difficult, and African Americans in the major cities and in the South may have a harder time finding jobs. So he says, all right, we're going to set aside jobs for minorities. And then he says Native American nations have been treated badly. They are their own nations, and yet the federal government took over controlling them. And so he gives self-determination back to the Native American nations. He restores their land for the most part, funds health care. So we have the Indian Hospital here, and he sets up a Secretary of Indian Affairs. And so he says, look, let's try to make sure that the Native American nations are able to do what they need to do. So this is when the Cherokee and the Chickasaw and many of the other tribes reestablish their own governments. All right, this is a piece that is really interesting. So we are in the middle of the Cold War, right? The really difficult part of the Cold War. In 1962, you have the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the US and the Soviet Union come the closest they've ever come to killing each other, like just destroying the earth, right? So now the US and the Soviet Union are like, hey, you know what? Let's back off a little bit. Everybody just kind of sit in their own corner and let's not have problems. China looks at this and goes, Soviet Union, you're a bunch of wimps. What is the point of communism? Communism says we're going to overthrow democratic nations and we are going to take over the world. Well, if you're worried about nuclear war and you're not fighting, are you taking over the world? No. And China goes, what a bunch of wimps. China uses this opportunity and they say, you know what? If the Soviet Union is going to be a bunch of wimps, we are not wimps. They have pushed against us. They have caused problems for us for decades. In fact, for at least a century. China and Soviet Union had this huge, huge border between the two countries, right? And so China says, hey, Soviet Union, stop acting like bullies. The Soviet Union just pushed into Czechoslovakia. They have people on the Chinese border. And China says, we're tired of this nonsense. So there's a little place. And all right, so you can see in the big map, there is China and the Soviet Union. In this map, what you see is the far eastern part of the Chinese-Soviet Union border. How many people live out here? Very, very few, right? This is not a big area that's like, hey, we have to control things. And then up in this little bitty tiny area up here, what you see are some islands. How many people are living on those islands? 0. How many factories are on these islands? 0. How many huge, amazing mineral deposits, gold, oil, anything like that? 0. Why is there a fight over this? Because China says back in 1870, the Soviet Union was a bunch of jerks and they rolled in and they forced a treaty on us that isn't appropriate and we're tired of their garbage, so now we're going to fight back. So nobody was on these islands. The Chinese decide, you know what? We're going to go ahead and we're going to start popping up on these islands because we believe these islands are Chinese. The Soviets are up in this area and they go, wait a minute, we just saw some Chinese on the islands, so now we're going to come back. The Soviets roll in, and as a few Soviet soldiers walk onto the islands, the Chinese open fire and kill them. Does anybody care? Yes, the Soviet Union cares a lot. Now, why does the Soviet Union care about islands that we have to have 3 maps to actually show where they are, and there's nothing of value?
They don't want to look weak.
Yeah, it's just a pride thing. We made a deal. Those are our islands. You can't tell us where we have to be and where we can't be. And so the Soviet Union now decides, you know what? We were attacked. We're going to attack back. So the Soviet Union comes in and they actually start fighting the Chinese. The Chinese bring a lot of people up. The Soviet Union brings a lot of people up. And there are these border conflicts that last for weeks and months, right? And so now as these two countries are fighting, how many countries in the world have nuclear weapons? Not that many, right? And there are only 3 with substantial numbers of nuclear weapons. And these are 2. When the fighting increases, finally the Soviet Union starts to deploy their nuclear forces. They start to increase the level of readiness of their nuclear forces. Now, at that point, this is a real concern, right? If you're China and you start to see the Soviet Union getting ready for a nuclear war, what do you have to start thinking about? Who's going to be my friend, right? The Soviet Union has more nuclear missiles than China, and they're like, okay, I need a friend. The Nixon administration sees China concerned and sees China looking for a friend. Now, why is this important to the U.S.?
They don't want a nuclear war to happen.
They don't want a nuclear war to happen. There's a couple other things in addition. So, 1, they don't want a nuclear war. 2, who is our biggest rival?
Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union. And up to this point, we have always felt like the Soviet Union and China were almost like one country. They're both this communist, huge, power. And now we're like, maybe we can split the communist nations and they can work against each other and with us, right? So that's the first thought. There's another thing. We're in the middle of a war, right, with Vietnam. Who is supporting Vietnam in this war? China and the Soviet Union. So if we can get China to stop supporting Vietnam, then maybe we can end the Vietnam War without losing, right? So Nixon has a lot of ideas, and so he comes in and he goes, you know what? How about I will recognize China. He is the first president to go to China, communist China, and he says, I will recognize you. We will have an agreement. We will have a lessening of tension with China, right? Now, if you're the Soviet Union and you are preparing for a nuclear war with China, and all of a sudden China, instead of siding with you, starts to side with the U.S., what does that make you think? Now, you're the one that's going to be in trouble, because if you start a war with China, the U.S. might nuke you. And so all of a sudden the Soviet Union's like, whoa, 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 whoa. And so they come to the U.S. and they're like, would you rather be friends with China or would you rather be friends with us? And the Nixon administration says, you know what? We're happy to have friends everywhere. And so the Soviet Union and the U.S. come up with a treaty that basically says, hey, we're going to back off. We're going to have better relationship. So everybody's going to calm down a little bit. Nobody's going to throw nuclear weapons anywhere. And this is called détente. Now, like I said, the big part of détente is a reduction in the threat of nuclear war. But the other opportunity is what it does for Vietnam. Now that the Soviet Union and China are both working with us, we can go back to the Vietnam War and we can say, we're going to fix this. We're going to calm things down a little bit, right? And so when Nixon came into office, he said he had a secret plan to end the war. And the secret plan was going to let us have peace with honor. Now, realistically, how do you have peace with honor? You win, right? Now, was Johnson trying to win? No. So Nixon comes in. What does Nixon, what do the American people want by this time? The American people want us just to get out of the Vietnam War. But Nixon says, look, we're going to get out with honor. we are going to walk away, and if we don't win, we're at least going to have the same perspective as we had in Korea, which is we didn't lose, right? So he starts to change a lot of things that he thinks will gain him support to either win the war or at least push the North Vietnamese enough that they will back off and we can walk away with 2 Vietnams. He establishes a lottery in the draft. So, what is a lottery?
Looks like lottery is like lottery, is normal lottery, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you take a ticket and they roll the thing around and somebody pulls the ticket out, and if you win, but it's supposed to be completely even chances. Why is this important? Why is this better than the Johnson draft?
You can't get out of it.
Okay, so if you remember, the Johnson draft was based on people sitting in front of you, and they can be influenced by, is your father rich? Is your father poor? Is your father going to have, an impact on my business? And so now he's like, you know what? We're going to take this out of those hands. We're going to just put numbers in a hat and draw out the number, and whoever gets picked gets picked. So he says this is going to make it a lot more fair, a lot more even. Then he says, since we are doing this, the threat of the draft is going to be 1 year. Once you have gone through the draft for a year and your number was not picked, we won't bother you again. Why do you think this is a big impact? Again, if you are a 19-year-old, are you going to be happy to know that you have one shot at going to war? And your chances may be higher in that 1 year, but once you survive that 1 year, you're off the hook, right? Does that make sense? Would that make you happy? Yeah, because now I don't have to worry about going to college. I don't have to worry about anything else. I have to survive that 1 year, and if I don't get picked in that 1 year, I'm done. So then he goes with a random selection based on your birth date. So when they pick, they say, all right, it's going to be everyone that's born March 1st or the 5th of the month or the 31st of the month. Later, we have tested that, and it appears that the way the numbers were set, if you were at the end of the month, your chances of going to Vietnam were higher, but it is as fair as they could figure it out at the time. Then in 1973, he changes to an all-volunteer military. Why is that a big impact? Because now there is no draft. Now you're not going to be forced to go to a war you don't support. If you don't support it, then that's fine. Just walk away. If you are willing to support it, then you join the army and you go fight in Vietnam, right? In addition to changing how we select people, he also changes how we're going to fight. So he decides, I got to make sure I get the right term for it. It's Operation Duck Hook. Operation Duck Hook says the U.S. is going to go in, we're going to take the fight to the Vietnamese instead of, as Johnson did, you stay in South Vietnam and wait for the North Vietnamese to attack you. He's like, no, we're going to go into North Vietnam. We're going to bomb North Vietnam. We are going to attack into North Vietnam. We're going to bomb the bridges between China and North Vietnam. Why is this important? Because it prevents China from joining the fight. It puts the Vietnamese on their own. It also cuts the number of supplies that are coming in from China to support the war. Then he says, we're going to mine the harbors, 3 different harbors in North Vietnam, where they are getting almost all of their supplies to fight the war. And he says, we are going to go in and fight in the Ho Chi Minh Trail. We're going to go into Laos and Cambodia and shut off the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is where the North Vietnamese are dragging all the stuff into the south, right? So all these things are going to accomplish one thing. They are going to put a lot of pressure on the North, and they are going to not allow them to continuously bring stuff to fight in the South. This should have had a big impact. However, by this time, the Tet Offensive has occurred. What do the most American people want by this time?
Or to stop.
They just want the war over. And so they're like, no, we're not going to allow this. Congress actually says we're going to stop, and the American people get really frustrated. So we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the next thing he does is called Vietnamization. He starts pulling U.S. troops out of Vietnam. Why is this important? Why are people angry? Because U.S. kids are getting killed in Vietnam, right? So if now there's a change to an all-volunteer army, and while the draft was in, it's a lot more fair, and we start pulling Americans out, he thinks maybe the U.S. is going to be more willing to allow us to win the war in Vietnam, right? He establishes secret peace talks, because what he's found out is when the talks are in the open, U.S. students and other people are pushing and saying, hey, you need to live with whatever the North Vietnamese say. Just, you get out. If they offer you anything, take it. And he says that's not how to win a war. That's not how to accomplish your goals. If you go into a car dealership, my wife and I have talked about this. My daughter and I have talked about this. The first thing to not do in a car dealership is walk up to a single car and go, wow, I love this car. If you do that, what does the price of the car just do? Yeah, the dealer's like, oh, in that case, you're paying full price. So you go in and you're like, you know, what are your options? All right, well, I could take this, I could take that, I could take this other one. You know, what's the one you're going to make the best deal on, right? And so that's what he's saying. He's like, when we go into these peace talks, I want the ability to say, hey, I'm going to offer you some choices, and you have to pick from my choices. I don't have to take the only thing you offer. So they have peace talks. He requests the silent majority support his Vietnam plans. So this is one of the first times you hear silent majority, right? What is a silent majority? What is he implying here? Okay.
The ones that still want to fight in the war?
Okay, so he says that he believes all of these protesters are loud, they're boisterous, and they're seen everywhere. But he's like, they don't represent the average American, right? The average American says, hey, I want to just win this war. I want this war to go away, but I don't want to lose it. And he says, so I want you guys to push, and I want your voices to be heard just as loud as the protesters' voices are. I want you guys to help me win this war, or at least get out with honor, versus walking away with our tail between our legs. He uses the relationships with China and the Soviet Union to say, hey, you guys need to stop supporting Vietnam. Stop helping them to defeat us. If you want a good relationship with us, then you need to back off. And then finally, like I said, you have the bombing campaign and the incursion into Cambodia and Laos. to stop the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So how does Nixon do on these things? Badly. All right. The first thing that happens is the Cooper Church Amendment. The Senate basically says, we are going to cut all the funding. You cannot go into Cambodia and Laos. Anything that moves into Cambodia and Laos, we are cutting the funding to the military on. So you have to stop. It's kind of frustrating because, again, you have the Ho Chi Minh Trail there. And so the North Vietnamese and the communists have been using Cambodia and Laos for almost the entire war. Why are we not able to fight there? And yet, who gets to make this call? The Congress, because they own funding. All right, then you have loads and loads of protests. Some people within the Nixon administration leaked the plans. And so all of a sudden, everybody's like, wait a minute, you're increasing the war, you're not stopping the war. And we told you we want to stop the war. So a bunch of protesters who call themselves the Mayday Tribe come in and they say, if you won't shut down the war, we will shut down DC. Now, they are calling themselves the Mayday Tribe probably because they are associated with communism, because the Mayday has been taken as a big thing for communism by this time. And so they're like, we're going to shut down the government. Then you have a load of students who are going around the nation in different places, and they are pushing on campuses, and they are saying we're protesting and creating protests. A huge group of people moved to Kent State in Ohio. Kent State is a regional university, a lot like Rogers State University, probably a little bigger. But all of a sudden, there are people from all over the US that are converging on Kent State. One of my professors told me he went to Cornell and he was at Kent State. So you're driving all the way from New York to Ohio to participate in these anti-war rallies. I want to make sure that my voice is heard. So they meet out on the center of the campus, or like we have, and they say, we're not going to go to war. We want to make our voice heard. You have to stop fighting this war. The school says, hey, you guys need to calm down. Everybody needs to go back to class, and let's just, we'll do this in a better fashion. The protests get more raucous. That night, the protesters go downtown and they continue the protest downtown. They break store windows. They flip cars. So the mayor says, all right, you know what? The problem is we have a bunch of drunk college students, so they close the bars. This just makes everybody more angry, and so the violence increases. The violence gets to the place where there are active fights between the police and the students, or the protesters. So now the mayor calls the governor and he says, I need help with this. So if the governor needs help that is bigger than the police can provide, who do they go to?
National Guard.
The National Guard, right? When we saw Arkansas, who do you go to? National Guard. So when it becomes a bigger thing than the police can handle, you say, all right, we're going to bring in the National Guard. Now, as the National Guard comes in, there is a problem. There are two big groups now, right? Protesters and National Guard. What do the protesters see when they see the National Guard guys? They see a threat. They see guys in uniform, and they're here because they hate the military, and there is military uniforms, and so they're like, we hate these guys. We want nothing to do with them. Now, conversely, what do we know about the National Guard that we talked about? Does the National Guard ever deploy to Vietnam? No. So who are the guys in the National Guard? They are guys who didn't want to go to Vietnam, but they don't have the money to go to college, right? So now you have a group that sees the other side. One group sees the other side as a bunch of warmongering people who are in military uniforms and we hate them. The other side says, we didn't want to go to war. We are in the National Guard to prevent ourselves from going to war, but we see you as privileged little jerks who got to go to college. You didn't have to join the military. You didn't have to go to basic training. You just had your money, your parents throw money, and you went to college. So do you see how these two groups of people really don't like each other? This turns super ugly. The next day on the campus, the protesters are riling up and they are causing problems. They actually burn the ROTC building. The school and the leadership say, hey, you guys need to calm down. The students say, you have to meet with us and we will tell you our demands. Does the leadership need to meet with them? No. And they never set up an appointment to meet with them. So the students get more riled up, and again, they decide that they are going to, shut down buildings and create problems. The National Guard is brought in, and they say, you need to push these students out of this area and disperse the crowd. So the National Guard starts pushing in, the crowd starts fighting. So sort of like you saw in the Democratic National Convention, there are now where you saw fights between the police and the protesters. Now there are fights between the National Guard and protesters, but the National Guard starts pushing the protesters back out of the central area of the campus. All of a sudden, there is a push back. People start throwing things. They start throwing rocks and bottles. The National Guard starts to retreat. As they are retreating up a hill, people are moving in toward them, and the captain says, all right, let's go ahead and we will prepare for a fight. They lower their weapons, and there is a shot. Basically, the National Guard decides that they are being attacked, and they fire into the crowd. They kill 4 people. Now, a couple of the people are moving toward them. There's a couple of people who are killed. In fact, one of the people killed is an ROTC student. And another is a student, and they are way back in the back, and they're just watching what's going on in the center of campus. Why would the National Guard guys shoot them? It doesn't make sense, right? So what I believe happens based on where they're shot and how they're shot is the National Guard guys, some of them fired into the crowd, but many of them fired over the heads of the crowd because they don't want to shoot anybody. It's kind of, I'm going to give you a warning shot. We're scared. Don't come any closer. But what happens when you shoot a bullet into the air? It comes back down. And so what you see is some of the bullets that I believe were intended to not hit someone actually go out and hit innocent people who are not even protesting. This becomes declared the Kent State Massacre. Now, it's kind of sad because people use massacre in various ways, right? The Boston Massacre, only a few people died. But why is it called a massacre? Because we want everyone angry with the British Army, right? In the same way, the Kent State Massacre It is a horrible situation. It is a very sad situation. But there are individuals who have killed more people than were killed in the Kent State Massacre, right? And so it's a horrible situation. I wish it would not have happened, but it is a situation where you push two groups of people who can't stand each other, who are scared of each other, and it has a really bad ending. There's another situation in New York City where guys are coming and they're protesting, and as the protesters are walking down the street, you have a whole bunch of guys who are construction workers, who are, building things, and they're just average Joes who are trying to make a living, and they see these privileged students who are walking through the streets, and they're like, why don't you have a job? Why are you causing problems? And then one of the hard hat workers actually sees a guy carrying the North Vietnamese flag. And he says, that's too much. We are fighting North Vietnam. You carry the American flag. You do not carry the North Vietnamese flag. And so all of a sudden, the hard hat guys start chasing down the protesters and beating them up. And the police have to pull the hard hat guys away from the protesters and protect the protesters. In Jackson State University, a street runs through the campus. And so it's an African American university down in the South. People are protesting. The police hear words that people are throwing things into the road and damaging cars trying to drive by from the women's dorm. So they get there and they find there are men in the women's dorm who are throwing rocks and things down at the cars driving by. So they try to go up. Long story short, again, there's a fight, and I believe 2 men are killed. And all of this continues to create further and further dissension and disruption within the U.S. because the protesters are like, the police are harming us, the National Guard is harming us, everyone is harming us, we have to fight harder, whereas a lot of the non-protesters are saying, why are you fighting with the police? Why are you fighting with the National Guard? You need to back off and back down. So there's a lot of crisis within the U.S. It's almost a small civil war, right? And finally, there's a group who call themselves the Vietnam Vets Against the War. And these are guys who have been drafted, who come back and say, we didn't want to fight in the war, we don't think the war is right, and we don't want to do it. So in all of this, while this is going on, Nixon is pushing and pushing to make it difficult for the North Vietnamese. He finally gets them to come to an agreement, to come to the peace talks and say, look, let's talk about what it will take to end this conflict. And so they agree, and then all of a sudden they see this happening and they go, okay, no, we're not. And so from May to October of '72, Nixon bombs the snot out of North Vietnam. He just sends loads and loads of bombers and he bombs them continuously until in October they're like, okay, you're right. We will come back. They sit at the table for a little bit and then they say, oh, no, we're not going to do it. We think we can convince you to not be able to fight. So again, he sends bombers back and he starts to bomb them. Again, the bombing convinces them, all right, wait a minute, we really do want to come back. They finally agree that we will have two groups or two countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam, right? And that they will stay in North Vietnam and not invade South Vietnam. And the U.S. says, all right, if you won't invade South Vietnam, we will not mess with you. You can stay a communist nation. It'll be just like North and South Korea. Now, South Vietnam is not happy with this because they say, wait a minute, they still have all of the Viet Cong, they still have all of the people that came into the South are still in the South, and you need to tell them to leave. But is Nixon in a place right now in his political life that he can force something else on the North Vietnamese? No. So he's like, you know what, South Vietnam, shut up. We'll do what we're doing. And so what he is attempting to do at this point is allow the U.S. to leave and have this situation just like North Korea and South Korea. He knows that it's not going to last, but I think, and many historians believe, that his perspective is if he can have the peace talks and they agree to not come south, then when they invade, the U.S. can go back in and we can start fighting again. That doesn't actually happen. Now, the other thing that starts to occur is during the Kennedy administration and especially during the Johnson administration and into the Nixon administration. The FBI is worried. They say all of these Vietnam protesters are actually communists. They are supporting the communists, they are helping the communists, therefore they are communists. Now, do we want to have communists in the US? No. So the FBI starts working to root out all of these people who they believe are communists. Now, it's not only the Vietnam protesters, but the civil rights protesters as well, because they're saying these guys are a threat to the US government. We have to get them out. We have to, make sure that we identify who they are and reduce their impact on the US government. So the FBI starts investigating US people. Now, is there any problem with that? All right. If it is done with warrants, there is no problem. But they are not using warrants. They are just going in and saying, hey, we need to investigate these people. We will tell the judges when we have enough to go to court. This is illegal. Now, the other thing they do is they say, we are not capable of doing some of these wiretaps on phones that we need to do. Is there an organization that has the ability to listen in on conversations? Yes, the NSA. And so they get the NSA involved, and the NSA starts doing intelligence against US citizens. Is that legal? No, it's absolutely illegal. And they also get the CIA to start looking at US people. Again, it is absolutely 100% illegal for the CIA to do investigations of US people. So, all this spying is going on. During the Nixon administration, people start leaking, hey, we are doing things that are illegal. We are spying on US people. And as this starts to come out, people are like, wait a minute, there's actually some people who take over an FBI office, they break into the office, and they pull the documents out and say, look, they are spying on US people. We have proof. And so now people are starting to say, hey, there's a problem. We got to figure this out. At the same time, there's a guy named Daniel Ellsberg who works at the Pentagon, and he says, you know what? People have been lying to us about what's happening in Vietnam for the entire length of the time in Vietnam, going back to the Truman decade. People are not telling us the truth about what we're doing there and how things are working. So he steals some papers from the Pentagon and he takes them to the press. And he says, you can publish these. Now, at the time, the press was like, well, we have to kind of let people know what we're doing. And so they notify the government. Nixon says, no, you cannot publish those papers. Those papers are classified. you're not going to be able to declassify them and get them out into the press. The papers take it in and say, you know what? Let's take it to the Supreme Court. Is this worth the U.S. knowing? The people of the U.S., do they have the right to know what their government is doing? And what does the Supreme Court say? Yes, the Supreme Court says the U.S. people own the U.S. government. So yes, there are things that we don't want everybody and their dog knowing. However, if there's a case where the U.S. government is doing something that is harming the U.S., that the U.S. people have a right to know, and so the publication, if it does not cause an inevitable, direct, and immediate event imperiling the safety of U.S. forces, then you can publish it. Now, what does that mean? Inevitable. It means you have to prove that there is not a direct correlation that my publishing this document is going to kill American soldiers. So, is there an example? Yes. If I have war plans and I say, hey, we're going to have this group of people attack in this area at this time, would that be an inevitable threat against U.S. forces? Yes. Then what about direct? If you can't tie it directly that, hey, your release will kill U.S. soldiers, then it doesn't matter. And it has to have an immediate impact. So it can't say, hey, if you publish this, sometime 20 or 30 years from now, it might kill people. So it has to be inevitable, direct, and immediate. And it has to threaten the safety of U.S. forces. Now, once Nixon knows this is going to go out, he's like, we have to reduce the impact this has, right? So he decides the best way to do this, he says, look into Daniel Ellsberg. What do we know about him? What can we do to discredit him? And what they find out is Daniel Ellsberg suffered from depression. And he went to a psychiatrist. So that's a good way to trash somebody, right? At the time it was. I mean, now, if I said, hey, look, you know, somebody is going to a psychiatrist because they suffer from depression, what would you say?
Why are you telling people's business?
Yeah, you're like, okay, lots of people suffer from depression. He's getting medical help. Leave him alone, right? But at the time, it's like, nope, this is not good. So now Nixon gets really nervous. And he's like, who's behind this? Oh, I know who's behind this. Who doesn't want Nixon to get elected in the next election? The Democrats, right? So obviously, the Democrats are behind this. Now, the weird part is the Democrats nominate George McGovern. There are loads of people because there's not a Democratic candidate, so they have 11 candidates start out trying to get the presidential nomination. George Wallace has an impact, and people are really nervous about him because they believe he's racist, so someone tries to kill him. The Democratic Party, just like they do in '68, they fall apart. McGovern represents the youth and African Americans, but the party stalwarts don't like him. So they're like, all right, what are we going to do? We have to do something different. We really don't want this guy. So he grabs a guy named Thomas Eagleton as his vice presidential candidate. He thinks, all right, I'm going to be on the left edge. Eagleton is going to be more in the center. So this will be good. The bad part is, within days of nominating Thomas Eagleton as his vice presidential candidate, somebody whispers in his ear and goes, hey, you don't want that guy. Look into him. You know what they find out about Thomas Eagleton? He's depressed and he's gone to a psychiatrist. Right? Again, is this a big deal? It shouldn't be, but they toss him. So Nixon wins 60.7% of the popular vote, and if you notice, he dominates the election, right? So loads of people really are happy with what Nixon is doing. They're like, yes, you're way better than what the Democrats are offering, except Nixon is an idiot because he thinks that the Democrats have been trying to cheat, and he thinks they cheated in 1960 and they're going to cheat him out of this election. He starts breaking into the Democratic National Committee headquarters to find out what they're doing and to find out what they're planning against him. These guys are a bunch of idiots. They break in, they set some listening devices, and then they go out and they test them and they're not working, so they got to break back in to put new listening devices in. Now, the second time they come in, this is an apartment complex, Watergate Apartments. And so the guard at the Watergate apartment complex says, hey, why are you guys here? And they go, yeah, we're here for plumbing. He's like, no, you're not. I know our plumbers, and I know that there's no plumbing problems in this area. Who are you guys really? And so he calls the police. When the police are called, they find out that there's several CIA guys and then the security chief for the committee to re-elect the president. By the way, if you ever are president and you're running again, don't name your re-election campaign Creep. It's not a good thing. So now Nixon orders the CIA, hey, stop the FBI investigation. Now, I think breaking into the Democratic National Convention would have been a bad thing, but now stopping an investigation and paying off the burglars, now there's a lot of problems. So now Nixon aides who are called up and, hey, what is going on here? They go, you know what? We're not guilty. There are tapes. Nixon tapes everything that goes on. Again, this traces back to the Kennedy era, at least, where the presidents are taping everything. And they say, go check it out. So the White House refuses to give up the tapes. Long story short, a Judiciary Committee brings 3 articles of impeachment. Nixon knows he's going to be impeached. So before the Senate can convict him, he resigns, and that is the end of the Nixon administration. So we are running short on time, but you guys feel comfortable with stagflation? All right. Increased in inflation and the economy is trashed. Nixon's goal in the Vietnam conflict is to have peace with honor. He tries to do that, but is prevented. Détente is using the Soviet and the Chinese against each other. And Watergate, everybody knows about. So, all right. These are the readings and the questions for next class. All right. I will talk to you guys on Wednesday.